Having said that, last week we did the episode 1 of Clement Dodd, and so today we want to go to part 2 of our presentation on Clement Sir Coxsone Dodd, OD, a man who contributed immensely to the development of Jamaican music that most of us as Jamaicans take completely for granted. And so today we're gonna step up a notch, a gear. At some point during the presentation, Dr. Dennis Howard should be joining us. And of course, Dr. Dennis brings his own academic and lived expertise to the Sunday Scoops program. But Garth, you ready?
Yeah, before we go any further, I'd just like to extend a warm welcome to all our listeners and those who are watching us on yardmedia.com, those who are listening to us on Old School Rules. Thank you so much for tuning and listening today. As Richard said, we have part 2 of Sir Coxsone, and we're just kicking it off with some music right away. Delroy Wilson, I Shall Not Remove. We started out with 4 big hitters. I Shall Not Remove, Little Delroy Wilson, Line of Judah, young Delroy Wilson. And then we played Joe Leagues, another Delroy Wilson. And we finished up with Andy and Joey with You're Wondering Now. And if you're wondering where that song came from, it is actually used as a theme song on that PBS show, Death in Paradise. So if you're a fan, that's the song, and that's a Studio One production. Actually became a very, very big hit again when that series started in London a couple of years ago. You said the song is actually called Joe Leagues, and Jamaica man have the term him say you have too much legs in other thing, so that's essentially where that come from. But this was Delroy Wilson, as I say, God, at around 14 years old. Yep.
And it was not unusual for the singers, musicians, if you will, to be starting at that early age. Last week we in part 1 of this program, Dr. Howard was on, and he made the point that some of these artists, and Delroy Wilson was one of them, who basically was handed over to Dodd by his mother, in terms of, as a father figure, if you will. And so it sort of explained his early beginnings and his entrenchment in the music. Right. Granted, after that, he would have left and he made his way over to Bonnie Lee. But today the focus is on Coxsone and his contribution to the development of Jamaican music. Now, you touched the scat era, and as the music shifted over time, the rock steady era wended its way. Granted, at this time, Coxsone wasn't a big hitter in the rock steady era, but he nevertheless held his own.
Not only did he hold his own, Richard, he created, along with, of course, the artists, rhythms that are still serving us today.
The test of time. And we're going to touch some of those rhythms today in terms of some of the songs that stood up. But, to Coxsone's credit, if you look back at the music, and again, we're touching on that scat era, Toots and the Maytals, Stranger Cold, Delroy Wilson, Joe Higgs from the duo like Higgs and Wilson,
and the Heptones,
right? All made their start with Coxsone during this period, and so the foundation of the music. Coxsone was there at the beginning. He made his imprint, and we're going to focus heavily on that today. One of the features of the Coxsone production, 62 rather, he opened his own studio after purchasing the property at 13 Brentford Road. And became, as it were, the first black Jamaican to own a piece of the industry, this newly developed industry. Remember, in the 1959, 1960, you were looking at people like this, like Stanley Motor started the recording,
right,
and they would have moved eventually to premises where they opened up Federal Recording Studio and basically established a pressing plant and studio facilities. But you know, these were the traditional Middle Eastern, Jamaican, brown-skinned business people. But Coxsone made the plunge, granted around the same time to Duke Reid had started his own treasure isle thing, but today our focus is on Coxsone. He established Studio One, and one of the first things that he did is that he, apart from selecting the musicians, he put his musicians on retain, well, he paid them a wage.
Right.
So they were no longer out on the road hustling as session musicians. So he could guarantee that he had a studio band. And it is from that studio band that a lot of the big hits
rhythms came
that
out.
You are going to feature. I think last week we touched on a few from.
We touched on a few last week, but
right.
I would just like to play two songs that bridge the gap between ska and rocksteady, and then we're going to roll into that.
There you go.
Yeah, that was primarily Jackie Mittoo and the Soul Vendors, and you can hear they left the blues influence on that last track, blues and funk.
In fairness, because this is what Coxsone was a big blues man. In fact, in its early days, we talked about him developing his taste for spinning music on his mother's sound system at the shop at Nanny's Corner, and this was the music he was playing. A lot of hardcore blues. In fact, when you listen to that Jackie Mittoo, the last two songs he played, you kind of get a sense of that sound coming from Atlantic Records.
You know that he was in the studio then.
Absolutely.
No doubt.
In fact, granted, he gave these guys a sort of a creative license. In fact, Mittoo was the man in charge of the musical, the arrangement side of the recording, while Leroy Sibbles from the Heptones had the responsibility for the talent, recruitment and so on. In fact, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but Sibbles was responsible for finding the talent, and so these guys, musicians would come, singers, whatever, little groups who would turn up at the studio for their auditions, and they would basically have the outline of a song. And as you pointed out last week, Garth, he would Sibbles would say to them, hum the melody, make we get a sense of where the song going, and then the minute he could pick that up,
that melody,
them run to the studio, and Jackie Mittoo come in and
keyboards and bring
and find the melody and bring it in and so on. But this was the value of a Studio One. It was the crucible of creativity. One of the feature of Studio One at the time, to remember Rastafari and the association with weed as a sacrament was a big part of the creative food for these young up-and-coming artists. And while most of these artists couldn't go to another studio, them certainly couldn't go to Treasure Isle, them can't go to Federal and smoke a spliff.
No.
But Coxsone wasn't encouraging them to smoke weed, but them could go around the back of the studio, on the backyard, light up them spliff, hold a little meds, put some lyrics together, and of course, once them in them that element, the encouragement, and the motivation and the creativity flow, and from that, them had the opportunity to run inside the building, pull together a Leroy Sibbles, and as we said earlier, basically structure the music around the lyrics. Or they would sit down with a Leroy Sibbles and some of the other the experience that was there, and they would literally restructure a song, right?
Yes, that's true. Because a lot of the activity too is breaking down some of the blues and some of the songs that came from the United States and redo it Jamaican style. So you'll find that a lot of the songs that we thought were original songs were actually redone songs. And I know Richie will promise in the new year we're going to do one of those Sundays where we look at songs that we thought were original Jamaican production and realize that there was an R&B version to that song. But some of the creativity that came out in the rocksteady eras, I'm going to run through a couple of those songs. But I'm going to start out, since you brought up Herb as the sacrament, holy sacrament, and Prince Buster's early bringing in the Rastafarianism into the music.
Yes.
I'm going to feature a song called Drum Song, and if you're listening, you'll recognize the song. A lot of times, bands warm up with this song when they're doing a live show. And this is Jackie Mito and the Soul Vendors again with a song called Drum Song, featuring the Sons of Negos. That will be Ras Michael and the Sons of Negos.
You played some Eptones towards the close of the last.
The Handle, and then I played Larry Marshall.
Two big tunes, but the Heptones specifically we wanted to take, because Heptones literally built a huge part of the Coxsone's legacy. Apart from the factor of their impact on the studio in terms of their own creative output, people like Leroy Sibbles, particularly Leroy Sibbles, that is perhaps one of the most talented Jamaicans, and not enough is said or is made about his ability. One of the biggest tunes that came out of Jamaica was that tune, Sata Masagana. Most people don't know that Leroy Sibbles was the bass player on that music, right? But apart from that, Leroy Sibbles was the man who was in charge of the Sunday morning auditions at Coxsone on a Sunday afternoon, actually. And, apart from just hosting the auditions, he was there, the principal figure to help a lot of these upcoming artists. A lot of singers come there with an outline for a song, but he would listen to them, say, hum the song, let me hear where you're going, let me hear the lyrics. And then they would take those same notes and restructure them and put them into a lot of the music that we know today take for granted. We talked about earlier Coxsone employing full-time musicians and putting them on the payroll. We mentioned in the last week's episode about their engagement with the Wailers. Coxsone it was who provided the Wailers with a lot of R&B music coming out of the United States for them to listen to, and they would reproduce a lot of those songs that became an integral part of the Wailers catalog, and in particular the Studio One catalog. Now, the thing that we need to not forget is that Coxsone was first and foremost a sound system man.
Yes,
right?
Definitely.
And the sound system was the single largest vehicle that basically guided the development and the marketing and the music. So Coxsone would put out a tune. Once it come off the recording machine, burn a dub plate, and Coxsone at one stage had about 5 or 6 songs. So on any given,
all of them named
downbeat. But the thing was, one of these sound systems would be playing at any night of the week. And so he would take the record or any new cuts that he wanted to get a feel from the audience and show those on the turntable. And that was what would give him an indication of what we should release. That's a critical part of the development of Jamaican music that a lot of us how many of us really understand, God, the impact of that kind of approach. What we want to do is use the next segment here to give a taste of some of these big songs. We talk about Leroy Sibbles playing on the Abyssinians' big tune, Sata Masagana. And of course, if you know anything about the music, Sata Masagana spanned one of the widest range of versions that you can ever think. But God, take it away.
So some of the big hits.
No, man, awake.
Studio One.
Awake me up.
About Declaration of Rights, Abyssinian, Sata Masagana, Marcia Griffith's Melody Life, Feel Like Jumping, Ken Booth, When I Fall in Love, the Heptones with We're in the Mood and Pretty Looks Isn't All, finishing up with Danger in Your Eyes, Don Evans and the Paragons.
Listen, that is my favorite version of that song, Danger in Your Eyes. Quite a number of other people have done it, including the late great Gregory Isaacs, but that Paragons version. You have basically opened the ants nest, God, and my philosophy has always been that the best part of the catalog of Jamaican music comes from the vaults of Studio One.
Definitely.
Right? You are now, you played a lot of essentially transitional rocksteady into reggae music.
Yes.
So the 1960s is now turning into the 1970s, and the music is shifting all over. All kind of players by now. Your boy is out there, Bonnie Lee, all the other producers, Prince Buster kicking up a storm. I think by this time Prince Buster had taken a hiatus from the business. But the industry is now wide open, and Studio One, a la Coxsone, have this huge vault of music, established rhythms that you need to do something with them. And in walks a man they call Lincoln Granulated Sugar Minot. And Sugar Minot, one of the most creative youths to come out of Jamaican music. Sugar Minot was a businessman.
Not only was he very creative, as I say, a businessman.
Right.
He was also a philanthropist.
Well, he established a number of little entities around the music, built around the music, where he was picking up a lot of the talent. In other words, all these Shocking Vibes crew.
But all that came later.
The thing about these crews and all them thing, they took their cue off Youthman Promotions. But as you said, that came a little bit later. Now, Sugar Minot came in, and he went to Cox with an idea of reawakening some of these rhythms. And so, because these rhythms are one of a kind, he got the nod from Coxsone, and they decided to pull up some of these rhythms. And out of that, we got
I just
people like Mr. DC.
At your term, pull up, you know, because, you know, that's a popular, pull up that.
True. Mr. DC, Vanity, among others. I'm not going to touch some of those tunes, God, just to give the people an idea of what we're talking about. And if you're just joining us, you're in tune to Sunday Scoops, and today we're featuring the work, the contribution of the great Sir Coxsone Dodd. Over to you, God.
District Constable. Yeah, back in the days, a district constable, none knowings, you know. You're a district constable, nobody respects you, except probably the people who you grew up with. You have to be a red seam policeman. Even if you're a blue seam, they might call you a blue bag. So you have to be a red seam policeman
you see?
Or a soldier, man.
In fairness, God, you're showing your age. Because trust me, back in the country, is DC run things.
Yes.
DC in a country is like a justice of the peace.
It's like informer.
No, worse. Them have all because them have powers of arrest, and so that's why the song say, "Mr. DC make me pass through."
Yeah.
Because what happens is the band go to the country for go reap some weed, and the DC is the only man in Freda because that's the only representation of police within those rural areas. But you know, the point is, and I've said it repeatedly, what we were doing then is our singers and songwriters were now taking complete ownership of the music to the extent that they were now writing their own experiences. Whereas with a rocksteady song, you know, you borrow the music from the overseas record and you probably do a little minor changes and a
rearrangement.
But here, this is a song that is literally
homegrown.
It's homegrown, and it is, you know, literally stating the experience that I just pointed out.
Yeah,
now,
the other rhythms we touched before that was I'm Just a Guy, Alton Ellis, which created the Vanity rhythm, and then I played the Sugar Minot Vanity, which was the original song, original 70s song. And of course, Michigan and Smiley did a version to that in 1978, 4 years later after Vanity was released.
There you go. But there are tons of other rhythms that came from the Studio One arsenal. So, Larry Marshall, Brentford All-Stars, Throw Me Con, Larry Marshall's Nanny Goat, the Shinehead rhythm, Real Rock.
Yes.
Then you had, we just explored the Vanity rhythm that, as you just mentioned. Carlton and the Shoes, the Love Me Forever rhythm, and of course, Freddie McGregor's Bobby Babylon. And we're gonna touch on some of these. In fact, we're coming up on a break, but let's get a little taste before we get there.
This is really need to be every Sunday, apart from cooking your Sunday rice and peas.
And you can cook your Sunday rice and peas while you're tuning to Sunday school.
Just want to also bring your attention to the merchandise that we're wearing. T-shirts and Rich's cap and his T-shirt. They're all available on our Yard Media website. That's www.yaawdmedia.com. We also have available masks, as you know, that is purported to be one of the best defense in this COVID time. And it's 3 in a pack for $20. So just go ahead, support the cause so we can be kept on the air. And, you know, again, just thanking you so much for tuning and listening.
Alrighty, now let's get back to the music.
Before that we did Throw Me Con and Real Rock, following up with Rockford Rock.
Well, we basically featuring the work of Coxsone and this huge treasure trove that he had of material. In fact, in the production side, Coxsone had a reputation because a lot of people tried to pirate his rhythms, and what I understand out there, Coxsone would allow somebody pinch a rhythm and is out there working it, and what Coxsone would do is just allow the thing to take set, and then he throw his legal apparatus on top of them and thing, but. The reality too is, the copyright thing was a factor. In the 60s to the early 70s, there wasn't a lot of control in terms of respecting people's copywritten work, and so one of the reasons why you would find different studios playing the same song, and there are different contributors to that. Coxsone, despite his contribution, had a reputation where he and the artist couldn't agree in terms of the monetization or the compensation for the artist. And so a lot of these artists would leave and go to another studio and re-record the material that they had done with him. So you will find like an artist like a Dennis Brown may have the same song on 3 different labels because of course,
they had to find their way to monetize.
He had to find a way, and he would basically end up with where he had the best control. I think that first a lot of the artists turned out to creating their own record labels and launching. But be that as it may, by the time the 70s now rolling in and this new approach using the Sugar Minot recommendation, the rhythms now is taking root within the dancehall community, and in fact, a lot of people tend to think of dancehall music as 80s or 90s, but the dancehall really had its genesis much, much earlier. By the 1970s, though, Sugar Minot's approach was to concretize that, because what Sugar Minot was now doing is taking these rhythms, and because he too was coming from a sound system perspective, because he played on a sound. He had his own sound, in fact, Youthman Promotion. And what he was hearing in the dancehall, he would bring it into the studio. And once a rhythm or a particular song took off in the dancehall, Sugar Minot would come back to Studio One and they would rework that rhythm. So you're creating more ammunition for the sound system operators, for the record shops. And so this is Coxsone and Studio One entrenching themselves as far as the development of the industry is concerned. We had only touched on a few of the rhythms from the period. Garth, run some more of these rhythms that we mentioned at the early outset. Freedom Sound.
Our song was originally done by the late Little Richard. And let me tell you, these guys just captured the essence of that song totally.
You know, as a man who collect blues myself, you know, I remember the song, the Little Richards version from early out. But when Roy Richards took that song, and this is a man who has some visual impairments, you know, most people don't know that. But Roy Richards literally took the song and owned it. Because after that, nobody remembered the origin of this song. I think it kind of was up to us. It is up to us to sort of put the thing into perspective. Because this again is the kind of the genius of Coxsone. And as one of our viewers, our listeners, just pointed out, that in his opinion, he thought Coxsone was a genius. And it's difficult to argue that guy, because here is a man who, the one thing that was clear is that he had the kind of ear for the music that basically sets him apart from everybody else.
Has been honed from he's been listening, growing up listening to music on a shortwave radio, traveling abroad and searching out these obscure songs that nobody would really get their hold on. So, get a hold on. So the fact is that he had an ear which was honed. But it's one thing to be given material and be presented, like the Heptones say, each is given a bag of tools, a shapeless mass, and a book of rules. But if you don't follow the rules or do anything with it, then all you still have is just a shapeless mass and a book of rules. So he did very well with what he got.
And as you made that point, I would hope that is the song you have queued up next, because to me, that is one of the biggest songs that, in my opinion, come out of the Studio One stables, the Book of Rules. But actually, Book of Rules it wasn't even a Studio One song. It was if I'm not mistaken, that was by Harry J. But yes, the bottom line, no, you can't play Harry J tune. Thing. Coxsone Dodd will give us a way out of the grave and kill it. But that was the ability of a man like Coxsone to create this kind of synergy amongst these youngsters. Because another thing that we need to remember, most of these guys who are putting out this music, they were late teenagers, early 20s.
And some of them were marginally illiterate.
And well, as a friend of mine said, she met Delroy Wilson at a function and went to him to get his autograph, and he had no idea what she meant by an autograph, just to give you an idea. And even so, when she pointed out she wanted him to sign something, he couldn't. He was not ashamed to say he couldn't sign his name. So, just to give you an idea of the environment that these youngsters were coming from at the time. But the fact that somebody of the ilk of a Coxsone and some of the other participants in the industry were able to take these youngsters and mold them into something that today we take for granted, a lot of that output that they were presenting. Garth.
Yeah, one of the songs I want to feature again is two versions of Rockfort Rock. The original by the Scatolites and then Sound Dimensions interpretation later on.
Hi there. If you enjoyed that clip, go on over to our website at yardmedia.com where you can watch the entire broadcast at your leisure. And while you're there, why don't you check out our other reggae music features? And before you leave, pick up some of our Jamaican reggae merchandise, and hey, don't forget to tell your friends.